Lecture 30, the whole tape, side 1 and 2, is dedicated to questions on the material on the second unit of the course, Grace. On the word grace, so he looks at those three meanings. First of all, just at the person's love, in this case, God, and then at the gift which was given, and then the recompense or the acknowledgement of the gift. The second one is the most important, because that's the effect which has actually been wrought as a result of God's love. So that's really what grace is, the second one. But the other ones have been used, or grace has been used for, in those other meanings as well, so he wants to call people's attention that these are also other meanings for grace as well. But the essential meaning is that effect which was produced, which divinizes the person's soul. The three types of baptism were of water, of blood, and then of desire. In the area of desire, there are two kinds, implicit and explicit. Recall we said that baptism was the way by which a person is able to achieve justification for the first time. And so in one way or another, a person has to have then baptism, either by water. Blood is the same as being a martyr. Desire, insofar as that a person manifests explicitly sometime in his life that he wants to be baptized, so there's some kind of expressed manifestation of his will. Implicit was that situation where he said a person's conscience is living according to what that person thinks is right, and the value system that is living for or that he's espousing implicitly contains then, because of that person's goodwill, grace or the giving of grace to that person. So implicitly then he would be a person who would accept baptism if he thought this was correct or right for him.
I have a question from one text. It was established that grace is in the essence of the soul.
Exactly.
Does that mean that everyone is capable of achieving grace, or is that only those with the essence of grace in their soul can achieve it, or those who don't have the essence of grace in their soul have it for them?
Here's what happens is that if you can divide the human person into body and soul, which make his essence, and of course we add existence to that, then we're looking at the human person's soul and we're saying what makes that soul to be what it is, and we say it has its own whatness, and then it also operates through various powers. The intellect, the will, the eyes, and the ears are the powers through which that essence of the soul operates. It needs, of course, the body to function in this life. So as a consequence, then this is all natural to the person as we come into life, that he has an essence of a soul which is now blank, it's deprived then of grace or doesn't have grace. So when the person then gets grace, what happens there is he acquires an entitative habit, which now enables him to be divinized. You notice divinized at the very core of his being, since it pertains to the essence of what makes him to be human or rational. We said also that as a consequence of this entitative habit, this accidental quality, his powers also are divinized by what we call the so-called infused virtues, which are operational habits rather than an entitative habit. So then when a person achieves grace at baptism, what happens is the essence of a soul then is now divinized with this new habit which makes him divine. And there's nothing wrong with saying the person is divine, provided, of course, we realize that this is an accidental divinization, whereas in God it's a substantial or identified with his being. When a person loses grace, for example, the situation of Judas, who denied our Lord, and at least if we take these scriptures literally, and we don't know what happened afterwards, he had then lost grace, which meant he still had the essence of a soul, but now it was an essence of the soul purely natural without this entitative habit. Absolutely. The reason it's an accident, you notice, it's added to a person's nature. If the human person had grace as a substance, it would mean that his nature would be grace or he would be God. So in the human person then, the only way that he can get grace is by means of the so-called being, which is called an accident rather than a substantial being. Did grace can raise? No. Grace is always supernatural as we're using it. Now, Merton mentioned, you recall that grace, in reference to some of the very early fathers, they used grace for every gift that came from God, both natural and supernatural gifts. But as Christian tradition teaches it, grace is always looked upon as something supernatural. And the human person's nature then is what is natural, with grace added to it, making him divine or supernatural at baptism. If you refer that number 3 question back to number 1, that's essentially what it pertains to. So if grace is not something in the soul, then it pertains to only God's love, which means it's not in the soul, but only in God, which means the person would only have this, what we call extrinsic justification. So that number 3, if you just refer that question back to number 1, those 3 meanings of grace, and you'll be able to plug that in.
Can you explain
Extrinsic justification? Extrinsic justification means that the person is not, in his own being, in any way divinized. Rather, it merely means that God looks upon this human person with favor, or not imputing any guilt any longer to this person. So if we put God at the top of the scenario, and we put the human person with some kind of supple or blanket over him, and put Christ as the universal mediator, God looks at his son Jesus, and because of his redemptive work, he no longer considers, no longer imputes, or no longer regards the human person then as sinful. But does anything happen to the human person? No, he remains the same. This is called extrinsic justification. The problem with this, I think you can see philosophically, if the human person does not change, if God doesn't change, what does justification any longer really mean? Because the human person can't, in this situation, change, because God imputes no longer guilt, because he looks at his son perfectly obedient and pleasing to his Father. But as I say, he no longer considers the human person, but the human person doesn't change. If God doesn't change, the human person doesn't change, what does justification any longer mean? So that's why many Christians, Roman Catholics certainly, but many, as I say, even Lutherans and others, accept the so-called implicit or intrinsic justification, insofar as you have the person then interiorly changed with grace. Now, how this is explained, some people won't go into. In other words, is it a quality? Is it an accident? The Council of Trent merely says it's something which inheres in a person. So many people don't go into these philosophical explanation. Where do I categorize this or classify this as far as the categories of being? They don't go into that. They just say the human person is changed because of grace. So they look upon it as some kind of interior change then. Whereas extrinsic justification would mean no real change takes place, say, at baptism in me personally.
So we have virtue of grace. I mean, is there virtue without particular grace?
There are natural virtues which we can achieve by just good acts repeated over time. We acquire, for example, fortitude, courage, justice, acting according to those virtues. So they're natural virtues, sometimes they're called acquired virtues. These can be had in a person without grace. One can also have the theological virtues of faith and hope without charity. I say without charity, we'll see this in the unit that we're looking at now, the unit on faith, because charity always accompanies grace. So when a person has sanctifying grace or justifying grace, that means the person then is in orbit or now is ordered towards God, which means the person now is loving God above all things. A person, for example, could believe in the Trinity or divinity of Jesus and yet not keep the commandments. So this way, people will say the theological virtues of faith and hope can be without charity. The natural virtues can be without grace as well, but some people say they're not real virtues. We'll see this in this unit we're looking at now. real virtues, since all these virtues, these natural virtues and the theological virtues of faith and hope in this condition will not bring the person to his last end. And so they'll say that virtue only means what will bring the person to his ultimate happiness or goal. But you could have natural virtues.
Is grace itself an infused virtue?
Not, it's better to say it's a cause, or better even occasion of infused virtue. The reason why it's not an infused virtue is that grace actually perfects something prior to the virtues, namely the essence of the soul, whereas virtues always perfect the powers of the soul. So whether they're natural virtues or supernatural virtues, virtues always are attached to the spiritual powers of the intellect and will, whereas grace perfects the essence of the soul. So it's actually more radical. If you recall that diagram we gave of the nature, and from that the powers and the operations and then the virtues, you recall that we said that grace corresponds to the nature, since it's actually perfecting the very core of the human person's being before it comes to the level of virtues. The tree would be the analogy of the virtue coming from grace. Sure. If we look at, say, the chalk, and we ask ourselves, how is the white related to the chalk? We say, well, the white in some way belongs to the chalk. But you notice we don't say the very essence of chalk changes because of the white, but rather because it's perfected by an accident now, a quality which makes it white chalk rather than just plain chalk. We say that the white belongs to the chalk intrinsically, in the sense that it's not moving. You don't see whiteness out here moving the chalk, but rather to say it belongs to the chalk. Formal causes are intrinsic to a reality, even if they're accidents, rather than extrinsic. So in this case, grace then would be a formal, like a formal cause, perfecting the essence of the soul. It's intrinsic to the person rather than pushing on the soul from the outside. Now, if we want to look at, say, actual graces, those helping graces that we described in question 112, they're moving graces. They move from the outside, but that's not sanctifying grace or divinizing grace, which is more like a formal cause. The reason why it isn't a strict formal cause is it would make the human person God if it were a strict formal cause. So it's more like a formal cause. Like the whiteness makes the chalk white.
Is grace only part of the supernatural virtues?
Grace is part of the supernatural virtues? Prior. Yes, it is prior. The reason for which it's prior, if you look at human nature, we say that human nature is prior to seeing or to hearing. They come at the same time, don't they? In other words, as soon as the human person has his whole nature, what happens at that time, he gets all the abilities, all the powers that come with that nature. But one can still speak about something as being prior logically, or sometimes it's called a priority of nature, even though they take place simultaneously. For example, if you said, which comes first, a substance or an accident, what would you say? Substance, sure. But you notice the chalk at this point is both white and chalk at the same time. But you notice I can say the substance comes first because the other is dependent upon it, isn't it? The whiteness. So I can say human nature then is the root or the source then of all the various powers. So I can say grace then is the root and source of all the virtues. It comes before the virtues. However, when a person is baptized, you notice that at that time he is given grace, which means he's given all the equipment. Just like when a human person has a human nature, he's given all the equipment that makes a human person a human person.
And now I could get that grace of
Exactly. And after baptism, of course, if a person rejects that, the person has to be converted by being sorry for his sins. In the case of the Roman Catholics and the Orthodox and a few other religions, they have some kind of confession for the restoration of the person. But in any case, he can get back that grace by, again, repentance of his sinfulness.
How do you get the natural virtues?
Work. You acquire natural virtues by repeated acts. If I want to be a kind person, I start doing kind acts day after day.
But you're moved by God's word.
Natural movement in that case, wouldn't it? Because you notice you're using natural virtues, so there's no supernatural efficacy that's involved there.
Question about, okay, the second question 112.
Go ahead.
That's preparation for the soul to receive grace, but isn't that using the power of the soul while grace is in the essence?
Yeah, what you're doing in that case, well, you have to use that preparation two different parts. First of all, you have to look at that preparation which precedes justification. That preparation, I think you can see already, is affecting the powers. And so you're right, it's affecting the mind and the will. And God is moving the person then, at this point, to see him as his last end or as his good. The will then is inclined or is attracted to that. Finally it says, let's bite the bullet and accept God in our life. So this is what we call this preparation that's done under actual grace, or these momentary graces. The other kind of preparation or disposition takes place at this point of justification. Thomas says at this point, the preparation is like the matter ready for the form. So at this time, when sanctifying grace is given, notice actual graces do not divinize a person. So when sanctifying grace comes to give a person, at this point, then the essence of the soul is perfected. So sanctifying grace then perfects the very core of the human persons, but before a person will accept grace in his life, he has to be prepared by these so-called moving graces or helping graces or actual graces, which then break down the resistances that the human person has to the acceptance of God in his life. So at this point, he finally says, I'll accept God in my life. So then God is an efficient cause, produces grace. The human person, with his consent, says, I'll accept this. At that point, then the person's soul is divinized.
The power of mind and the will, he achieves gratuitous grace?
No, gratuitous graces are these miraculous graces. So you can get sanctifying grace without ever having a miracle performed for you or seeing a miracle. So these, all grace, if you want to use the term very generally, all grace is gratuitous in the sense we don't merit it. But don't confuse gratuitous graces with grace. Gratuitous grace is a special kind of grace, namely those miraculous ones, like walking on water or something like this. So what happens is these so-called moving graces or actual graces break down the resistances or the obstacles that a person has so that he will finally accept God in his life at this point. But at this point, then, the essence of the soul is perfected. Yes. At that point, then, a person is in a situation similar to a natural person with his natural nature. We said even though a person had a given essence or a form, he still needed a movement or motion from God to use that form. Now, if we can place his form now at this point as a supernatural form or essence, since the essence of the soul is now divinized, he still needs graces to be able to utilize those. And those graces are called, again, these actual graces, helping graces. They come and go. Every time we pray, every time we do a kind act, every time we make an act of faith, all that's done under God's actual grace, even though we already have sanctifying grace. To use our divinized life, we're dependent entirely on God's actualization all the time. Otherwise, we would just be static. Good question. How do you get those? All you can do is dispose yourself, in other words, be a person of goodwill, in the sense that I try to do God's will in my life. In other words, I'm trying to be open to being a good person.
At that point, you're not baptized.
Oh, before you're baptized, you're in this scenario over here, in which you're starting at just a nature here without grace. So God has to start the process. There's no way that we can do anything by way of preparation. We would be a semi-Pelagian if we'd say that we start the process, then God starts. So God, as Thomas says, there's nothing that we can do by way of anticipating God's help. He has to start the process. And the reason for that, we're purely natural here. There's no proportionality between our natural acts and grace. There's no way we can merit grace. So if we're going to get grace at all, he has to be the initiator.
Well, with gratuitous grace, is that only different because
Gratuitous graces never divinize a person. They never sanctify a person. They never make a person have more love. They're merely inducements. For example, if a person during this period of time, say that you were living during the apostolic times, and during the time of Peter healing a cripple, you saw this miracle. you said, wow, maybe there's something to the supernatural life. But you notice, even to say, wow, you're already given actual grace at the same time as seeing a miracle. So the miracle would be called a gratuitous grace given to Peter, so that by his action, other people then would be induced to think about the supernatural life. But you notice in gratuitous grace, it doesn't actually affect the person directly. It's like reading a good book. It's like seeing a landscape or a sunrise or a sunset, except this is much more extraordinary.
So if the dog's kind of like more than one person, like the couple?
Yes. Now the person himself could, for example, if tomorrow morning you found the marks of Jesus on your hands and feet, you might be impelled to say a prayer. Or if you began to walk on Lake Harriet over Minneapolis, you might again feel that this is kind of, extraordinary. No, it only works insofar as it's given at that one point. But remember that the created order, going back to something we learned earlier in the course, the created order always is propped by God's causality. It's not only put into existence once, but the prop is always there. So all the time we are in grace, God is exercising his causality, efficient causality, keeping grace there for us. Unless, of course, we turn away from grace, which we can do by our free wills. So grace, you're right, it's just like the created order being brought once into existence, the universe, but every moment it still doesn't know its existence to itself. Therefore it needs God.
They don't actually give you justification.
Right.
When your obstacles are in the way.
Exactly.
Then is justification just given by God and things were right? Or how's it?
Well, both ways. In the first place, you're right, he is the efficient cause of giving grace to us when he thinks we're ready, but by that time we, by our free acts, cooperating with these things, have actually extricated, have weeded out these obstacles. He's not going to do it without our cooperation. He's not going to do it without our free will. So we're involved in coming to this act of faith, just like Thomas Merton in his life was anguishing over his own state, anguishing over what his purpose in life was. So notice his free act or his free will was involved in those actual graces, even though hindsight is a lot clearer. At the time we can be just very confused and sometimes in lots of suffering and anguish until the time that we receive grace, and then we can look back and see how many things were leading up to that point. But as I say, it needs our cooperation, it needs our consent, and God's efficient causality, both at the same time. If you want to use an analogy, the lectern here is moved, but I am moving it. Both take place at the same time. I'm imposing a form, namely movement form, in this lectern, but the lectern is responsive. It's consenting to being moved by me, if we can use the lectern as a free agent. Exactly. That's in the natural order and in the supernatural order. He must move us first.
What's the difference between the nature and the powers of reality?
The nature merely tells a person what a reality is. A tulip is that reality which has tulipness and existence. And then you say, well, what does the tulip do? Well, because it has that kind of nature, it is able to grow, it's able to reproduce, it's able to assimilate food, so it's able to do all kinds of things through its various vessels or veins or powers. So the nature then merely tells us what the thing is, but the nature always operates through these powers. The powers are sometimes called the properties of the nature. How the nature functions, how it operates. When a person thinks, we don't say that his nature thinks, we say his intellect thinks. In other words, we look at the proximate cause of an activity. When a person sees, we don't say his nature sees, we say his eye sees. So the nature then is giving the person a definition of what it is, the whatness. The whatness operates through various abilities and powers. If you recall that big diagram we gave early in the course, all the various powers that the human person has, rational, non-rational. So those are the whole spectrum. of abilities which we have that our nature enables us to, how our nature enables us to operate. Both are habits, I think you realize. So we're dealing then with an entitative and an operational habit. Habits, you recall, are qualities. Qualities are accidents, and accidents are a kind of being. So in the area of habit, or a disposition, which enables stable disposition, which enables a person then to be well disposed towards some actualization. We now have some that perfect the very substance of a person, and that could be either the body or soul, since those are the substantial parts of the person, part of the essence. And we have some habits which perfect the powers of the soul. The substantial perfections are called entitative habits. Notice the term entitative, by the very word itself, tells you it's going to perfect the beingness of something, the entity of something. Whereas the powers, the intellect and will, are going to be perfected by operational habits, which enables then those powers to operate better. For example, if we're concerned about issues of justice, by repeated just acts, we become a just person, which means now I have a new operational habit added to my will so that I'm able to choose particular realities and make a just assessment and a just action based on that. Because now I have my will plus this new operational habit for this new operation. So entitative habits then perfect the substance or the entity. If I'm speaking about the body, it can refer to something like the health or the sickness or the beauty of a body. If I'm speaking about the soul, I talk about grace as being that entitative habit perfecting the very essence of the soul, and virtues perfecting the powers of the soul. Virtues are operational habits. Any change I make?
Well, your operational power, would that be anything added?
Sure. What's happening here, every time I perform, say, a good act, I'm either cultivating that habit, or I'm maintaining that habit, or I'm intensifying that habit. Say we take the circle as being justice for the sake of example, and say I keep performing just acts. You notice what I'm doing is intensifying my virtue of justice, or I'm making myself more just, so that normally now, rather than just sporadically, occasionally perform just acts, I will almost always be just. Because notice what I've done, I've cultivated my virtue to such an intensity or degree that now I've become a just person. So notice that as we perform acts, yeah, it does change us. Accidental. It can't change us substantially. We're still human persons, aren't we? But it can change us accidentally, and that's very important. You recall when we looked at article number 3, we said going from being to a certain degree good to a nature which was simply good, we said the way that it went from this imperfect stage to this perfect stage was by means of virtues. And without those, we'll always be infants in our moral life.
Did you say grace is an efficient God and not
the only way that you could say that is that if you look at the soul as an efficient cause of the person's activities, insofar as, for example, whenever we act with our limbs, say to move our hands or feet, we need a will act. The will chooses to move. So in that case, we can call the will an efficient cause, or sometimes it's said to command the other powers of the limbs, the eyes to see. You can close your eyes, you can open them. So you notice we have a choice over these things. So in that sense, we can say grace is an efficient cause of the various powers, of the various activities that we do. But in itself, just like the soul, we say the soul is the form of the person. Then once it's a form, then we can say it's an efficient cause of the activities. But initially, it first has to be there, otherwise you wouldn't be able to perform activities as an efficient cause. So the soul has to be with the body, as you know, the form which enables the person's essence to be what it is. So we can say that grace then is the same thing, and first of all, it has to be a form, in this case an accidental form, perfecting the essence of the soul. Once it's there, then I can say it can perform as an efficient cause. But it is a formal, it's more like a formal cause, grace is initially. Otherwise, I wouldn't have anything to be an efficient cause with. No power, I'd just be blank. Well, you can use them the same, but the only problem is the way they're distinguished by Thomas and many other theologians is that these so-called helps from God are just momentary inspirations from God, whereas grace is this permanent, stable condition of a person's being a child of God. For example, when a person is sleeping, does he have grace? Well, I'd have to say if he were a child of God, he would have then sanctifying grace, even though at that time he is not being moved by God to think or to love doing some particular act. Whereas these helping graces are these so-called movements from God. And so grace can be seen, first of all, just as these motion, or it can be seen as this more permanent quality, this entitative habit perfecting the essence of the soul. So it depends on how you want to look at grace. But there are several kinds of graces. Just like gratuitous grace is one kind of grace, we call it miraculous grace, sanctifying grace is another, actual grace is another. So there are all kinds of graces. You look at the effect, what it does to distinguish the various graces. The reason why it implies something in the person who receives it is because it is more like, as we said, a form, in this case an accident. So it's that intrinsic justification that makes that person a divinized or a divine person as an entitative habit. So that's why it's in the person rather than extrinsic or outside the person, say in God only. If you want to use an analogy, say that you have a person that comes up and says to you, I love you. And you say, well, how are you going to manifest this? And the person says, well, I just love you. And you say, well, maybe love should be expressed in some kind of gift, some kind of acknowledgement that's exterior to just the person's own affections. So that's the first meaning of grace then would be just the love of the person. But you notice that just stays in the lover. Whereas the other one is some kind of gift of myself or of something else to a person. Notice this is where I'm showing outside of myself my generosity, my goodness. This is grace, properly speaking, the gift. Material object and formal object of... Yeah, don't think about that one. That's the unit on faith right now. And let's just stick with the one on grace for now so that we'll get a chance of that one later.
Yeah, just explain how grace makes me answer here and never get grace and accidentally in my soul.
Exactly, and how is it in God? Pardon me? Yeah, if it's accidental in the human person, how is it found in God? Exactly. So you notice we are both divine then. God, however, is divine substantially or by nature. We're still divine, but we're accidental. In other words, ours is a created grace given as an accident. His is uncreated grace, is his substance or his nature.
Does grace make God our final cause?
God.
In other words, the things which
Grace does do that in the sense of our supernatural final cause. We could still speak in philosophy about a natural final cause, namely this happiness, contemplation, and virtues that Aristotle speaks about. But you're right that grace essentially in God's providence is that reality which now puts us into orbit or orders us to our supernatural end, namely God. It's really charity that does that, but charity comes always with sanctifying grace. So we're now, as I say, in orbit. And the reason for that, of course, we have a divine nature now. So we're now like God, if you will, or like God's own nature, ours, of course, being created accidentally. But yes, that does put us into God as our last and our final cause.
What that last one understand?
What does...
What does St. Thomas say that man's sanctifying grace is God?
Yeah, that refers back to the idea of the child of God, refers back again to the distinction between substance and accident. because we are now divinized by this new entitative habit in the essence of our soul, we actually are children of God now. Yet this still doesn't make us God substantially or by nature. His is uncreated grace, ours is created grace. But we don't want to deny the fact that we are supernatural or divine with grace. The early fathers were insistent on that. And because they wanted to show the radical change as a consequence of being reborn. We're no longer the same. We're really different now.
Then it was just what you're saying is we become divinized.
Exactly. By this accidental perfection in the essence of our soul.
Can supernatural grace work in us even if we lose sanctifying grace for a time?
Sure. And the reason for that is that faith and hope can still remain unless a person commits a sin against faith or hope. For example, if I deny God's or faith, then you notice I have to start the whole process of, again, coming to faith. But as long as I have faith and hope, say that like the couple we gave in the very early part of the course, who were living together in sin because they knew with conscience this was wrong for them, yet they didn't deny the faith. So what happens in that situation then, God has to again give that person these so-called helping graces or actual graces to bring that person to a point in which again he's turned to God. And that's again done under God's grace. So at that point we're still having faith and hope then. We still have natural virtues. We won't be ordered to everlasting life in that state. But God still has to give us graces so that we will turn again towards Him. But we still have at least some remnants of grace at that situation. Faith and hope.
What are the two kinds of good
Two kinds of good that nature. Those are that imperfect situation or that good to a certain extent and then that good simply. For example, we don't call an infant just morally good because he hasn't done anything yet. But we say that he is morally good when we see a person of some character. He's just a good person. So we're looking at that nature then as acquiring a certain kind of rectification or perfection in the second state. Whereas that first state, we look at it as just having a whole bunch of potentialities, but they still haven't been actualized. So it's like imperfect or perfect, or a potency to act.
So virtue is something that helps us obtain grace.
It depends on when you talk about the natural virtues and supernatural virtues. The natural virtues, because they are dispositions found in a person who is doing good acts. You can say a person then with lots of natural virtues is more disposed towards grace than a person lacking these natural virtues. Since a person with natural virtues at least is trying to do what's good in his life, even though he doesn't have grace. So we can say that they dispose a person for grace. God still has to, of course, give actual graces to the person so that finally he's turned to justification. Supernatural virtues, however, follow from grace. They're like the tree example that we gave. That grace is the root then of the supernatural virtues. Virtues always perfect the powers of the soul. Grace perfects the entity, the essence of the soul. So virtues then are the means by which we do good acts. And if they're supernatural acts, they follow from grace. If they're natural acts, they follow from our human nature.
Can you go that one idea that God cannot some people know?
In that question, you have to look at two issues. First of all, one has to look at just God himself in his own nature. And we have to say in that sense, his love does not change. So we have to say that God's intrinsic nature then, or intrinsic love doesn't change. And the reason for that is God's being is total. Always acts at the same time. If we said there was any change or difference in love there, we would be admitting some kind of potentiality, or really we would be saying that God isn't total being. So we have to then look at that example in the sense of the effect. What happens to those things outside of God? And then I can say, well, some effects have more or less. Well, how did they get the more or less? Well, since they weren't there appealing to God, and since God is not dependent on those things moving him, if they have more or less, is because he caused those things. Since causality always follows from my willing something or choosing something, since willing is an act of love, I can say God caused, God willed, God loved then this effect more or with more than this other effect with less. And it doesn't make any difference whether you want to look at this from the natural plane or the supernatural plane. The gifts are still given by God, whether they're natural talents which are given more or whether it's in the area of grace. In each case, of course, well, especially the supernatural area, we have to consent with our free will. God isn't going to do this without our consent. Many of our natural gifts, of course, are given to us just in the circumstances in which we find ourselves, the country, the family, those things in which we find ourselves. But even for the natural virtues, even there, God can, as I say, cause some persons to have if I can use the term, easier time with the natural versus another person. But in either case, you're talking about something outside of God, or another way of saying that, the good which is produced, the object, rather than looking at some intrinsic change in God himself. Now you're asking the why question, or the Job question. Why does God do this? You'd have to know the mind of God. And we don't know that answer. It's a mystery. That's all we can say.
Okay, but it couldn't be because necessarily the law of he's not moved by the...
No, he's not moved by the creature's good. It's because he chose to give this person more. That person in some way has a role to play in his providential plan for the world, and because of that role, he decided to give that person more grace than another person. Say like St. Paul. Why was he given this great enthusiastic grace of being converted and then going about with this great charity for his neighbor and also for God, saying it doesn't make any difference whether I die or whether I'm here. In either case, it's good because I'm trying to do what I'm supposed to do, or love God. If it's dealing with the grace, it's always God's special love. If it's dealing with the natural goods that are given, it's dealing with God's common love.
Can you consider anything being divine that...
It's always supernatural. Either supernatural, now remember it can pertain to God himself, which is divine, or it can pertain, for example, even this unit we're looking at now we call supernatural faith, divine faith.
So if we were to participate in anything that was divine, that would be...
Supernatural. Exactly.
This one is explain the details of nature versus supernatural and achieve his end goal. And if you look at this one chart that's in the how do you put that?
If you look at that article number 3, where we have that nature good to a certain extent, the nature perfected. The nature goes from that first state to the second state by means of virtues. So as the person then perfects his various powers or his abilities, notice he's perfecting his nature indirectly, because his nature is now operating better for what it's supposed to be. But the way we do that is through the various virtues, and that's all the moral virtues and the theological virtues. You say, yes, moving graces, helping graces, and actual graces are all the same. They're only transitory. They're from time to time. They come and go. Whereas sanctifying grace is something which is habitual, permanent, stable. There aren't any natural graces. You can use the term, but I would avoid the term, because what you're really talking just about created favors, created talents. which we don't use the word grace for those. Sometimes a person says he's blessed with many graces, referring to the fact that he has a good intellect, or a good family, or something else. But that's an equivocation of the word grace. And it's better to avoid that. Christian tradition does not use it for that. The problem there is you're looking at what the soul is, its entity, and we say the soul is something which is natural. Grace is something supernatural. So grace then in that sense is more perfect than the soul. Natural and supernatural being opposed. And then we ask ourselves, however, how is the soul greater than grace? We say the soul is a substantial part, or sometimes just the word substance is used. Substances are greater than accidents, since accidents depend for their existence or depend on a substance in which to reside. So in that sense, grace, because it's an accident, is less noble than the soul, which is a substance. As an accident, which would you say is greater, the whiteness or the chalk? Pardon me? Sure. Chalk is greater because it's a substance. So if I look at the soul, I say the soul is greater because it's a substance in grace, which is an accident. But there, notice what I'm doing is looking at the kind of being that grace is and the kind of being that the soul is. Sometimes it's called a mode of being that the soul has and grace has. In the sense of a mode of being, then a substance is greater than an accident. So you have to twist that question both ways, depending on what you're emphasizing.
That I have an answer is not to understand why and how can grace be called one of the formal causes or efficient causes. And if grace is not acted upon the soul after the manner of an efficient cause. Okay? So the correct grace is not. See, that's what I don't understand. I
Just best thing to do is recall that there are intrinsic causes and extrinsic causes. The intrinsic causes refer to the matter and form. Extrinsic causes are efficient and final cause. Those are those four causes we looked at in just before the first unit, the presuppositions. Grace is more like a formal cause because it belongs to the thing itself, like the whiteness to the chalk. Efficient causes always act on the thing from the outside. I am moving the chalk from the outside, so I'm an efficient cause, but you notice I don't become part of the chalk. So I'm not a formal cause, whereas whiteness is a formal cause. It's an accident, but it's still a formal cause. It's intrinsic. So grace, then, is going to be more like a formal cause in a sense it belongs to the thing, the essence of the soul, rather than efficient cause acting on the soul from the outside. Grace doesn't push our soul from the outside. Helping graces do that, but not sanctifying grace. He uses the analogy, Thomas, of whiteness makes a thing white and justice makes a thing just. Just be questions for those who might want to ask the questions on any part of that unit on grace. Two different kinds of habit. First of all, recall that a habit is a stable inclination of a person with reference to some kind of actualization. So first of all, we can look at the kinds of being. We said that could be divided into accidents and substance. And then we said one kind of accident was a quality. And we said underneath the quality we have habit, which is the strong inclination or holding of oneself with reference to some kind of actualization. We said there were two kinds of habits. Some was perfected the very substance of the person, either the body or the soul. And we said that these were what we called entitative habits. Since they perfected the very beingness of something, the word entity tells us that, so they're going to the very core of the nature of the human person, either the body, for example, with reference to health or beauty or sickness, or the soul with reference to sanctifying grace, which makes that soul divinized. The other kind of habit is going to perfect, rather than the substance, the powers of the person. And we're speaking here of powers. We're speaking about the spiritual powers, the intellect or will. These are called operational habits. Sometimes operational habits are also called virtues, or they could be called the contrary, namely vice, because virtues perfect the various powers of the soul, whereas grace perfects the essence of the soul. So then grace is going to be what we call an enitative habit, perfecting the essence of the soul, whereas the virtues, both natural and supernatural virtues, are going to be called operational habits, and they will always perfect the spiritual powers of the person, the intellect or will. Now the other powers of the person are also perfected. For example, his powers of concupiscence and the irascible appetite, namely with reference to anger and sexuality and drinking and food, they're directly perfected by the so-called, their own habits, but they're directed underneath the intellect and will also, temperance and fortitude. So essentially they're called spiritual, the spiritual powers, the intellect and will perfect them, are perfected by virtues. Operational can be both natural and supernatural, right. So if they're natural, we call them natural or acquired virtues. If they're supernatural, we call them supernatural or infused virtues. These all these virtues perfect the powers.
You think of the operational powers as permanent?
As permanent? You can. The difficulty is that one can perform actions to the contrary, in which case those habits then disappear. For example, say that I turn out to be, or initially work to be a just person, or even a temperate person, then after a certain period of time I say that's too much work. And so I start doing unjust actions or intemperate actions. Notice those virtues now are going to disappear, and the contrary is going to be, or it's going to take its place, the vices. So normally the habits will stay there. In fact, Aristotle says they're relatively difficult to extract once they're in place, because I've been so habituated so a long period of time doing things. But they can be by just the opposite, by performing actions to the contrary. Pardon me? The power is permanent because the power belongs as a property to the very nature of something. And the nature, of course, unless the nature itself disappears, in the case of the human nature, of course, by death, but the other nature, say, of an animal, the powers and that kind would just disappear once that nature had disappeared. The human person, of course, because of his spirituality, lasts forever.
Could you give us the vision that the gratuitous grace is sometimes referred to as numerically?
All right. The gratuitous grace, if you want to use the term gratuitous just from its origin or etymology, it means something which is just free or freely given. So if you want to put it into some kind of scheme, one could say that gratuitous refers to anything which is free, or a grace used in a very general sense. And then you can divide this into the so-called natural, if you want, and then into the supernatural. And there you would divide it into those things that are sometimes called properly supernatural, and those things that are called improperly supernatural. The properly supernatural then dealing essentially with sanctifying grace, and even actual graces insofar as they're leading up to sanctifying grace or the utilization of that. Improperly supernatural are just these so-called gratuitous graces. Think if you use the term miraculous graces, we have a better idea of these so-called gratuitous graces. For our purposes, we will never consider the term natural as a grace, because that confuses the whole difference between nature and grace, the natural and the supernatural. So we're going to eliminate the natural as being, as to say, a grace at all, even though one can say that the human person's nature is only due to God's gratuity or God's favor. But we don't want to speak about this as a grace. It just confuses the issue. We went through the whole Pelagian issue, say with Augustine already. At that time, he wrote time and time again that grace is different from nature. So why just go through the same errors again? So the thing for a Christian theologian now, the best thing to do is just exclude the natural from any grace. So we're then into the area of the supernatural. And Thomas says that some graces sanctify a person, make the person pleasing to God, divinize the person, some do not. The properly supernatural do, the improperly do not. The properly supernatural do insofar as we have a permanent situation here. This is only a transitory helping grace leading up to this, or the exercise of this once is present. The second term then, the so-called improperly supernatural or gratuitous grace, if you see the term gratuitous grace, it always refers to these miraculous graces, never to anything else. If you see the literature in the theology, that anyone who is careful in theology will use the term gratuitous grace for these so-called miraculous graces, or sometimes the word is used the gratia, data, gratis for this, but we don't have to look at that. But as a technical word, whenever a person uses these or this term, you know that they mean these so-called miraculous graces.
In your study question, when you say, I don't understand this, if grace is not something in the soul, what are the alternatives?
Yeah. Would you, on that number 3 question, refer that answer to number 1? Because if a person knows the 3 meanings of grace, he knows 1 is found in the donor, the giver, the lover. The other 2 are found in the recipient, both as the gift and then the thanksgiving. So grace, if you want to get down to the bottom line, grace refers to the actual gift which was given. What I wanted to do by that question was to emphasize the intrinsic justification rather than the extrinsic justification. Intrinsic means a person is actually changed. The extrinsic, you recall, merely meant that God looked upon this person and no longer imputed evil to him, even though the person never was changed interiorly. Grace is said to be more like a formal cause rather than an efficient cause. You recall that when we gave that division of the 4 causes, we said 2 are considered as intrinsic, 2 are considered as extrinsic. The intrinsic causes were matter and form. The extrinsic were the efficient cause and the final cause. The 2 intrinsic actually refer then to something which is interior to the person, or in some way make up the constitution of the person, whereas these other 2 are found on the outside of the constitution, acting on the reality from the outside. Grace then is more like the so-called formal cause, because Thomas says it's more like the whiteness that's in a chalk than the human person by moving the chalk from the outside. Notice I am an efficient cause moving the chalk, but I'm not part of the chalk. Whereas grace is part of the human person, even though it's only an accident, and therefore it's not a strict formal cause. If it were a strict formal cause, we would have to be in some ways by nature divine, or substantially or essentially divine. So that's why it's after the manner of the formal cause. In the case of whiteness or justice, they actually are intrinsic to the person, they inhere in the person, but they inhere as accidents perfecting the substance. Whereas an efficient cause always acts on the reality from the outside. We don't think of grace acting on us from the outside unless it would be a helping grace. But that's not the same thing as sanctifying or habitual grace. And question 110 is dealing with that.
The matter of the material of the human, that's the body through which the actions are done.
Right. The matter is the body through which the actions are done, yeah. They're both necessary for the essence of a thing, yes. But the body by itself is sometimes even spoken about as the instrument of the soul. We're children of God or sons of God because we have now Yeah, an accident which perfects the very essence of our souls. And because we're now, by grace, made divine or supernatural, we actually have a divine nature. Bear in mind, however, that our divine nature is always an accident, whereas in God it's a substance, actually identified with his being. Whereas in our divinization, it's a created perfection which comes after our natural natures are there already. If you want to use an analogy, the chalk comes before the whiteness. Our human nature comes before grace, because you need a substance before you can add an accident. Before you can add whiteness to the chalk, you have to have something there already. Sometimes that's called a priority of nature or a logical priority, insofar as one reality precedes the other, even though both may be there simultaneously. For example, God could have created the first human parents, both with a human nature and a divine nature at the same time. But even there still would have been a priority of the human nature before the divine nature, in which that accident then would reside.
Side question, can that accident be stronger in some individuals?
Well, sure. And the accident can be stronger in some individuals. For example, say that I'm developing a virtue, a habit now, with reference to the issue of justice. And initially, my determination and my habit is relatively weak. As I perform more and more actions with reference to justice, or giving to each person what is that person's due, you notice what I'm building up is a stronger and stronger intense habit, or another way of saying that, the quality is now being intensified, or I'm becoming more just in my behavior. It would be even more difficult for me later on to be unjust, because my habitual performance is to act this way. This is where the habit is now growing or intensifying, and so the accident now can be found in one person in a greater degree, another person in a very mild or weak manner. It's also the way why we say that persons should grow in the spiritual life through life, and that really means an intensification of charity in their life.
That's where the human person will play a part in the grace.
The human person is cooperating, but God is moving the person at the same time. So both are involved, aren't they? Both on the natural plane and on the supernatural plane. God is moving me with his natural motion in the case of natural virtue, supernatural motion in the case of supernatural virtues, but in both cases my free cooperation, voluntary acts are necessary.
Could you lose grace?
Sure. For example, a person sanctifying grace you can lose by performing an act which involves an act in some ways against charity or the will of God. An act, for example, would be adultery, murder, in which case I lose grace and I lose charity. Then what happens to regain that, God again has to give me these so-called helping graces so that I can again turn back to him. And then for a person, say, in the Roman Catholic tradition, and the Orthodox tradition, and a few other traditions, they say that the sacrament by which a person is reconciled again to God is a distinct sacrament, rather than just the individual person going to God directly, as some religions teach. But in either case, you notice that God still has to give me those graces so I again can be justified, or be again willing to commit myself to him. So a person can lose charity and grace at the same time.
Total loss.
Total loss of charity, total loss of sanctifying grace. The only thing that remains in those situations, we'll see that more clearly in this unit, are the virtues of faith and hope do not disappear unless the person actually commits sins against those virtues. A person could deny his faith, in which case he loses faith as well as charity. But say that the person out of weakness commits a sin of adultery but hasn't denied his faith, hasn't denied the Trinity, for example, the fact that Jesus is God, the sacraments, the church. So he still retains the supernatural virtue of faith, but to actually gain sanctifying grace, he has to be again converted back to God and choose God's will in his life, to be reconciled again to God. Right.
What is the difference between nature and the powers of reality?
Nature always tells me the essence or what the thing is. How I define a thing is its nature. Then I ask myself, how does that nature operate? It always operates through various faculties or powers And sometimes these are called the properties of the nature. Let's give an example. When we say that we see it with our eyes. You notice we're looking at the power through which I manifest and exercise that activity or operation. We don't say I see through my nature. We could. It would still be proper. But you notice we always look at the more proximate principles or causes of those behavior patterns or operations, even though we say that I am able to see because I have this kind of root nature, whereas a stone, for example, or gold would not be able to do that. So powers then are the faculties through which that nature operates. Nature is the reality of the whatness it starts with.
So when animate means the power would always be an activity of something.
Exactly.
What did you say that how is it different from nature and thought and reality?
The powers are the faculties through which that nature operates. And the nature itself is what is the wellspring, the source, the ground then, the foundation for those powers. It tells me what kind of nature I have, therefore what operations. If you recall, very beginning, of course, we gave this whole scheme on human nature, divided into so-called abilities. Those would be the various powers that flow from human nature.
Grace can't be a power because the power needs that nature to be removed.
Grace can't be a power. Power is something which always is found as part of the equipment of a nature already. It's a property. It's a substantial part, even sometimes called, of the nature itself. If I were to say that grace were the same as the powers, I would in some ways already be supernatural by nature. If I would say that grace would be a power, strictly speaking, a power, then I would be saying in some ways my nature would already have supernatural powers, that supernatural intellect, the supernatural will, supernatural eyes, supernatural ears, if I said grace was the same as power. Now, we use the word power equivocally, both for these properties and then for grace is giving me a new energy, a supernatural energy. Well, that's certainly legitimate. But then it's that accidental habit.
And just think of nature as being something that exists in itself, and power has to exist in the nature.
Exactly. Sometimes it's called, well, as I say, a property or something that belongs necessarily to a given kind of nature. Necessary in the sense it can't be without it. The common presence, as distinguished from the special presence in an indwelling, because every creature does not owe its own existence to itself, because it could disappear, be generated, be changed. Just as we go through life, we acquire all kinds of changes. We have to say that we don't have total being. So God then, as creator, gives us our natural being. In doing this, he then has to always be present to us. If he were not present to us as sustaining us, we would then fall out of existence. That's the reason why we gave the book as being propped up on my fingers or my hand, always dependent then on God's causality all the time. If you want to use an example, the sun shines not only initially when it comes to the windows, but it has to always be there if I'm going to have light. So it conserves that light as well. So if I look at God as creator, I have that same kind of analogy. If I look at him as the creator now of supernatural life or supernatural being, grace, recall we gave a special name for that. We said this was the result of God's special love, whereas the other one was the result of God's common love. This special love, or this grace equipment that was produced by this special love, now gives us new equipment. With this new equipment, we can now know God, and we can love God supernaturally. Or another way of saying that, God is now present to us as a conscious reality, rather than just being present to us, holding us in being. So you notice there's an idea of the intellect coming into play now, the will coming into play, both with reference to the God who is already there. But without grace, I'm unconscious or not sensitive to his presence. With this new equipment, I can be. And the more we dispose ourselves by good acts and by charity, the more that presence is able to be intensified.
Disposition similar to a power?
Disposition is a habit, perfecting a power. So then it's an accident which is added onto a power. If it's a light tending of one's person, we call it disposition. If it's a strong tending, we call it a habit. In either case, they're both accidents, they're both qualities.
In this question, you have the soul is said to be morbid and must be grace.
What you have to do is twist that question as to whether the soul can be more or less perfect than grace in two ways. One can first of all just look at what each of those things are. One can say that the soul by itself then is something which is natural. Grace is something which is supernatural, which is greater. In that case, I can say grace. Then I can twist the issue not from the standpoint of looking at what they are, but the kind of being they have. Sometimes it's called the mode of being, the way it holds its being or its existence. The soul in this case then is a substance or a substantial part. Grace is an accident, which is greater than a substance or an accident. An accident is dependent on a substance, so substance then is greater than an accident.
But the grace is in the soul, right?
That's right. But the whiteness is in the chalk too. But the whiteness needs the chalk in which to inhere. Otherwise, whiteness would not be able to exist at all. We don't see whiteness out here. It has to be found in a substance. So grace then, you're right, grace is inhering in a soul as an accident. And we get that accident at baptism. Does that make sense? So you notice there's something then added to us like the whiteness is added to the chalk. We start out neutral, if you will, with no perfection there. Then we have this new addition at baptism called this entitative quality habit, which perfects the essence of the soul. That goes back to that distinction of the four causes again. Recall we said that two of the causes were extrinsic, two of the causes intrinsic. Matter and form were intrinsic, efficient and final were extrinsic. Grace is more like a formal cause insofar as it belongs to the soul rather than being on the outside of the soul as an efficient cause pushing it or as a final cause drawing the soul to it, like the donkey being drawn by an apple. So we say that grace is like the whiteness then in the chalk, in the sense that it's more like a formal thing belonging to the reality intrinsically. We don't want to say it's a strict formal cause that would make the human person God. No, if it were a strict formal cause, it would have to go with matter to make up the essence of something. In which case, then we'd have grace in our body. making up the so-called supernatural nature, which would make us God.
And where does it lie?
No, it lies, first of all, you have the essence, which has to be created first of all. The essence, as you know, is made up of matter and form, body and soul. In this case now, we're looking at the soul as having powers and an essence. The essence of the soul is what makes that soul to be what it is. The powers are the faculties through which that essence of the soul operates. So I have to look at grace then as perfecting the essence of the soul. So you notice I need the soul initially before I can add the whiteness to it, or the grace to it. So the soul is more like a substance then, and grace is like an accident, a formal cause.
Is the reason that grace is not the same as virtue because virtue is part of our nature?
No, virtues are not part of our nature. If that would be, it'd always be good. So as a consequence, grace is not the same as virtue because grace perfects the essence of the soul as an entitative habit, whereas virtues, both natural and supernatural, always perfect the powers of the soul, the spiritual powers, the intellect and will. So these are called operational habits. This is called an entitative habit. Now we can, as you mentioned, they're not belong to us by nature, but we can acquire natural virtues by our natural powers, by repeated acts. You can use that term. I wouldn't, though. I'd use operational habits. Otherwise, you might confuse them with the intellect and will as powers.
So, if operational habits are the supernatural, then what's the difference between supernatural and virtue?
Well, the supernatural virtue proceeds from grace. If you want to use the analogy we use, like the tree, which is at the root of all the activity. Now, if you want to use an analogy for this, you can figure out that nature gives rise to the powers, which eventually gives rise to all the operations. Grace gives rise then to the supernatural powers, which are called virtues in this case, for supernatural operations. So grace is then the wellspring, the source, the root then, or it virtually contains within its power, like an acorn, the oak, all the supernatural power and operations that a person will do. But you notice grace perfects more radically the person, his very essence, whereas virtues perfect something more proximate to activity, namely the powers.
That's why you can have grace in a soul without the powers necessary to perfect it. A little child.
That child at that point, however, has the perfections insofar as he does have the supernatural virtues then. He still, through life, has to cultivate and deepen those and enrich those virtues. But if he wouldn't have those virtues already at the time he was baptized, then he wouldn't have the equipment which belongs to the supernatural nature. So he has all the virtues at that time that he's baptized. Faith, hope, and charity, the whole works.
Doesn't have a rational intellect as such.
The child? Intellect has a rational intellect. He just can't use it. If I said he didn't have one, then I would say he's no longer human. The powers of the nature always go with the nature itself, even though I can't use it. Otherwise, the person who is unconscious then also could be said not to be rational. Therefore, we could kill him. Euthanasia, if you will. So they're in a latent stage. or in a sometimes called a habitual stage. They can't be utilized, but they're still there. Pelagius said that the human person, by his natural powers, could achieve everlasting life. You recall we said already in question 109 that everlasting life is something supernatural and therefore is not proportionate to human nature. But Pelagius' teaching, if you want to be a very strict Pelagian, he would say there was a supernatural end, but my natural powers are proportionate to that. A semi-Pelagian would not be quite as radical as that. He would say there is a supernatural end. I need grace for that. Therefore, my natural powers are not sufficient. But for the acquisition of grace, my natural powers begin the process. So you notice it's half Pelagian, if you will, or at least it's partially Pelagian insofar as I still have my natural powers that begin the process for the acquisition of grace. Christianity will say, on the other hand, that all the way from the beginning to the end, grace is necessary. Council of Orange in 529, the Second Council of Orange, and the Council of Carthage in 418. I want you to know those dates. The Council of Trent, you don't have to know 1545 to 63. But those are very important. See, if you're looking at the so-called development of dogma of grace, it's good to have a couple of dates on which you can hinge early formulations of the Christian church on grace before there was any real division of grace between Protestant and Catholic, for example. No, the virtue is actually acquired by repeated acts. So they result from my doing good, just acts that I become just, or gradually acquire the virtue of justice.
So it's a state.
Well, if I would have virtue, once I have virtue, then I would be in a state, a habitual state. But how do I get to that habitual state? I have to start performing operations. Then as a result of those operations, I acquire the so-called virtue or the so-called state. He's mentioned this permanent state. Then in turn, you notice that when I'm in that state, virtue is a cause, an efficient cause for better operation. So it results from operations. In turn, it becomes a new help for me, a new principle, a new habit, for my own operations then.
So you can also call the act itself a virtuous act.
Yeah, you can call the act a virtuous act. It's only strictly called a virtuous act if it proceeds from a stable habit. The reason for which you can perform an isolated act and not have the habit, which means the next time it may not be that act at all. But you can use the term virtuous act equivocally in the sense that it stems from a habit or just that it's because it's like the virtuous act that we all aspire for. Aristotle says the person who is virtuous has the so-called possession of this habit, which makes then the person good and his acts good. But you notice the person is good because he's habituated with this habit. Then, because he has this, he acts well or good. This completes side 2 of lecture number 30, dealing with questions on the second unit of the course, the unit on grace. The remaining side of this tape, side 2, is entirely blank.